Hey everyone, welcome back to Engelbart Gaming. I did an episode of How About That a few weeks ago, showing Double Dragon for the NES, which in my opinion was the best home version you could get before arcade emulation became a thing. I've had a few requests since then to show the Sega Master System version of Double Dragon, which some people think is superior. So I figured, hey, why not? And here we are. Here's a quick glance at the arcade version of Double Dragon first, which came out in 1987. It was developed by Technos and distributed in US arcades by Taito. Notice how fast this game is, even despite all the in-game slowdown. Now, NES Double Dragon was also developed by Technos, even though it was very different from the arcade game and it came out in 1988. The Sega Master System version we're going to check out in a moment also came out in 1988 and was apparently developed by Arc System Works, which is a company that was made up of several former Sega employees when it formed earlier that year. Now, Arcade Double Dragon was 2 players at the same time, had a decent variety of moves, enemies, weapons, and it practically kickstarted the entire scrolling beat-em-up genre. Sure, Renegade/Kunio-kun was first, but this was much better, and there was actual complete scrolling levels unlike Renegade, which took place in arenas. NES Double Dragon's main game was 1 player only. There could only be 2 enemies on screen at one time, and they could only be the same kind of enemy. Despite these limitations, it still plays great even today, as you saw if you watched my earlier video. Sega Master System Double Dragon is a 2-player simultaneous game like the arcade original. It can have up to 3 completely different enemies on screen, along with weapons. So you probably think this is a way better version than the NES game, right?
Well, you're wrong!
I'll explain as we go along. Let's get on with it. Here we are at our nice little title screen. Looks very good, the dragons look great, the theme song that they're playing here is pretty good, but it's only a clip from it, it's not the entire theme song for some reason. And here's our beginning with Marion getting kidnapped. Again, fairly authentic to the arcade experience, even though it's missing the text and the garage door opening and stuff like that. And you can see the characters are very squat in this version, even more so I would say than the NES port, but they look very similar to the NES version of the game, just slightly more squat and with more color. And of course, while you're not seeing it here, you can have 2 players at the same time in this one, which is why you see push start flashing in the upper right corner of the screen. And pay attention to that. One other thing I'm going to note here is if you are listening to the music on this part, you might think, hey, that sounds pretty close to the arcade game. And yeah, they did a pretty nice job. But this is not how us kids in the US heard this game when it was originally released in 1988 on our real Sega Master Systems. The US version of the Master System, of course, did not have built-in FM sound capability like the Japanese Master System, nor did we ever get the FM module add-on to play FM music in these games. But a lot of these games, like Double Dragon here, still had the FM soundtrack built into them. So most people discover through, the modern joys of emulation that when you load these games into an emulator, if you have the emulator set up for FM sound, you can hear those soundtracks. And once again, you can see there's just an awful lot of flicker in this version, and it's going to get even worse on some points. But here, Abobo is practically disappearing in parts, and you're seeing Linda behind him. The other thing that is not super apparent at this early stage of the game is the collision detection is kind of terrible in this game. Punches and kicks do not connect very well. Your best 2 moves in this one are your jump kick while you're moving and your standing still spin kick. For just regular punches and kicks, they just very rarely connect the way you want them to. Sometimes you'll punch twice and you'll clearly see it visually on screen, but it will only register either the first or second punch. And in these early 2 levels of the game, the first half, pretty much every normal enemy will get knocked down by 1 jump kick or 1 spin kick, but they just couldn't leave well enough alone and decided to really screw with that formula. So later on, as we progress here, you'll see enemies like this Abobo boss that take multiple jump kicks to even knock down, and that is just no good. And again, we are just seeing a ton of flicker in this section. And there's no cat sitting on one of the garbage cans. What a cardinal sin of Double Dragon development. And if you kill the boss, any remaining enemies will run off screen, and if you're quick enough you can do a nice little pose. Here's Mission 2. at first glance, you might think, hey, this doesn't really look much like the arcade one. So far it doesn't, but don't worry, it will. They just extended it by adding basically a couple of screens before you get to the stuff you see in the arcade version. It would have been nice to see something a little more creative here, but we got what we got. Once again, I want to point out that in that NES port of the game, you could only have 2 enemies on screen at once and they had to be the same kind. Here we just saw 3 different enemies on screen again. Now we've got 3 different enemies on screen with lots of flicker and also a baseball bat weapon. You can really see the awful collision detection at work with the baseball bat throughout this playthrough. I use it a few times. It especially gets worse for whatever reason in the next level when the enemies, the normal enemies, start taking more than 1 hit to knock over. And you can tell, just visually, it doesn't even look like I'm getting close to hitting them some of the times when it is hitting them. Other times, you know, it'll look like it goes right through them and just doesn't touch them. So now we're up to the section of the level that is based on the design of the arcade version, except they left out the big gaping hole at the bottom here, so we can't knock our enemies off into that. They're missing the fence that we could climb up here and all that stuff. So it's a simplified version, but I mean, at least it is a little bit longer. And come on, how could you leave the hole out? The best part of the game is knocking enemies into holes, and you took that away from us here. For shame. And getting enemies by the hair so you can knee them and throw them in this one, it's like a complete luck-based crapshoot as far as I can tell. There's no consistent method to do it throughout the entire game. Early on, you'll see me do it a lot. Later on, you won't see it as much because it just wasn't working. I couldn't grab them. And it's like this basically every time I play. If there's someone who knows a guaranteed way to do that where it works every time, hey, I'd love to hear it. You're better at this game than I am. Another neat little trick here is you can go to the edge of a wall and just throw, you know, a box or boulder or whatever against it, and it'll bounce in the opposite direction. Much like the NES game and almost every home port of Double Dragon, you cannot kick large objects in this game. Things like oil drums, boxes, or boulders. You can only pick them up and throw them. You'll also notice something else missing from this Master System version here. It doesn't have the treadmill that goes into the wall where there's a trash compactor or something that kills enemies instantly. Why did you guys take that out? And this enemy here, if you think he looks a little weird, this is the one that typically is a green palette swap of Billy and Jimmy in the arcade version. They kind of replaced him with this, who's still mostly a palette swap of Billy and Jimmy, but now he's just a different color. And there we are, that's level 2, or mission 2 I should say. It's mission 3, and we're technically halfway through the game according to the number of missions, but missions 3 and 4 are a lot longer than missions 1 and 2, so we'll be doing this one for a little bit. And here's where you can see, if I were to just do a jump kick here, it wouldn't knock these enemies over. You have to punch them at least one time first, then you can do a jump kick and it'll knock them down. Or you could alternatively kick them. While you haven't seen a lot of it in this game, you do have the elbow smash and you can do it whenever you want. You just have to press away from the way you're facing and the punch button at the same time. And it works pretty well for some things, but it's definitely not the go-to move in this. Much like with jump kicks, at this point in the game, it won't knock enemies down in one shot anymore. You'd have to hit them with either a kick or a punch first. And I want to say, forget about even trying to do punch and kick combos in this, meaning you keep punching and do an uppercut and knock an enemy out, or keep kicking until you do a standing spin kick to knock them out. It just doesn't work well in this game, at all. I mean, it's not even worth trying because the collision detection is so off. Once again, I will point out this game's most glaring problem, and that is that we see an awful lot of flicker here, even when there's only 2 enemies on screen. And when you're playing in the 2-player mode, there is even more flicker than you see in the 1-player mode, as you might expect. Now, to this game's credit, it doesn't reduce the amount of things on screen, it just flickers like crazy when you have a lot of stuff there. It's just too bad they couldn't improve this before release. And see, the layout of this stage is a bit different than the arcade version. We don't have the building at the beginning in the same way. We don't have the holes that are present throughout the arcade one. But they do include that iconic bridge and water for us to knock some enemies into. And we will definitely be taking advantage of that as soon as we can. So here, watch the bat in this one. See how I hit the enemy and it takes maybe like a full second before it reacts and falls over? That is no good. How do you let something like that get into a final game? And the speed on this game as enemies try to align themselves or get around you when they just walk vertically up and down in straight lines, it is torturously slow. I mean, it is really bad. It's another thing where I just don't get how they left it in here like it is. I mean, this just does not have the speed or fluidity that the arcade game was known for, and frankly, I don't think it feels anywhere near as good as the NES version, despite the fact that it's throwing so much more around on screen than that one. And here we are at the infamous Forest Bridge. It's a little bit different than the arcade version, and primarily it's a little bit simplified and shorter. And yeah, we'll just throw him into the water. And you're next, Williams. And there we see the little splash that time. We didn't get to see with the Abobo because he was too far towards the bottom of the screen. Now we can do some more splashing on this side. And once again, you can see the holes are missing from the arcade version. There should be a hole on the floor right over here too. And here you'll notice that when I pick up the whip and start using it against enemies, that the collision detection problem rears its head once again. Many times they have either a delayed reaction, or they don't react at all to getting hit and it just goes straight through them. This is another one of those things that really should have been buttoned up and corrected before this game was finalized. And yeah, I'm going to stand around here for a while. I'm going to make sure not to scroll the screen because I want to have access to this water to knock enemies into, because it is by far the fastest way available to kill these enemies. If I were to just, defeat them using my punches and kicks and martial arts moves alone, it would slow this game down tremendously, and we would probably be looking at another 4 or 5 minutes for this level alone from this section. Look how tiny the boulder is. Isn't it adorable? In the arcade version, of course, these boulders are maybe 75% or so the height of Billy and Jimmy, and I'm sure that they tremendously outweigh Billy and Jimmy, but they can pick those boulders up like they're made out of paper and just toss them around without any problems at all. And this next segment of the game that takes place here is going to be a smidge tedious, but it's only going to last a minute or two. I'll explain things in just a moment. And the reason I'm hanging around at this edge of the screen instead of the back where like the cliff side is, it's hard to knock these enemies down there. I don't even remember if you can. It's been a while since I played this. But your new enemies emerge from here when you kill them. So if you stay all the way to the right side when you kill, like let's say these two Williams, the next enemies are going to come all the way from the left, and they walk so painfully slow, it takes forever for them to get there. So I try to stay kind of in a middle area where I'll have access to start basically wailing at them or throwing a rock at them right away. And one thing you can try and do here is try to line the enemies up so you can hit both of them with one boulder throw. You're not always going to get it, they won't always cooperate, but anytime you can hit both of them at once, it's going to speed things up a little bit. And I will once again draw your attention to the massive amounts of flicker that we see every now and then, especially when there's a couple of enemies on screen along with a weapon on screen, like we're seeing now. So it's just something you gotta get used to with this version of the game, unfortunately. There's one Abobo down, and it's a lot slower if you're just fighting them and not throwing the boulder at them. And in the arcade, there's a break here, and it says invade the enemy's base, and this is a new section. In the Master System version, we just continue on, and the layout's a little different. We don't have that rock face that we climb up vertically in this version. So everything is just going to continue to the right. But here, these enemies take a lot of hits and knockdowns to kill. So getting rid of them this way, tossing them over the cliff, is just so much more efficient. And it takes maybe a quarter of the time of beating them the old-fashioned way, to death. Another one down, we'll have a few more to go. One kind of funny thing here that I'll point out from the Sega Master System manual for Double Dragon is this character that's a clone of Billy and Jimmy. His name is Jeff, but they mislabeled him as Willie and the machine gun toting boss as Jeff in the manual. Whoopsie. Now, one gameplay quirk of the Sega Master System version of Double Dragon is that you have unlimited continues for the first 3 missions of the game, and then you're not allowed to continue at all in the 4th mission of the game. So if you go into the mission 4 with one guy left and you die, that's it, you gotta start over. Except, there is one little way around this little problem, and I will show that to you when we get there, so if you've never seen that before, prepare to have your mind blown. Anyway, back to the task at hand here. You'll notice that I'm going to use my boulder primarily by throwing it and bouncing it off the wall. That's because you usually don't need to have as big a gap between where you are and where the enemy is in order to hit them this way, so it just makes it a little bit easier and a little bit faster. I'll also point out here that we only have to defeat the Abobo. We don't have to kill the Williams, or if you have any of the Jeff enemies left, you don't have to kill any of them either. You can leave everybody else alive. You only need to take care of Abobo to actually finish this mission. Anyone who's left will just go and scurry off the screen at the very end once you defeat Abobo. And if you really feel like it, you can kill, the standard enemies before they get away, but I'm just going to let them go on. Here we are, the end of Mission 3, and here's Mission 4, our final mission. You'll notice it doesn't say press start in the upper right anymore, because you can't start or continue here. Unless you know this trick I'm about to show you right now. All you have to do is when the level starts, before you move, do 10 standing spinning kicks, and then you'll be able to continue again. If you're in one-player mode, you'll see that press start for player 2 starts flashing again in the upper right corner. Now we have the devious traps from the arcade game here, like the moving bricks and the spears that stab you, so it's pretty authentic, at least from that standpoint. Now as far as these traps go, the bricks are a lot easier to avoid on the Master System version because they move a lot more slowly and in more predictable patterns. As far as the spears go, they're still a lot easier to avoid in the Master System than the arcade version because they stab less frequently and less erratically, and they're also slower. But it's still easy to get killed by them if you do manage to get hit, so you've got to be careful. Hey, I managed to grab an enemy. Now you'll see they gave us another set of bricks and traps here to go through. But again, very simple to get through in this version, no big deal at all. Same deal for the spears. And I'm just going to let him pick that up, throw it, and then walk into it, because that's the fastest way to get rid of that enemy. Now in this part, they've decided to throw way more enemies at us than they do in other versions of the game in the same area. So we have our 2 Abobos that break out of the wall, but then we've got a ton of other enemies, and then there's going to be more Abobos that show up. And because there's nowhere to knock these enemies down and no weapons to take them out quickly, this part is going to involve just a lot of slow and careful fighting. And if you didn't use the continue trick here, you might be in for some trouble. And this is where Sega Master System Double Dragon is at its absolute worst. Hand-to-hand combat. And for a beat-em-up title? That's a pretty terrible thing to have to say about it, don't you think? Kind of essential that for a game that's all about fighting, that you get the fighting right! And then you can also see there the Bobos when they can grab you and just throw you around like that. You're powerless. They're just going to keep doing it until you die. You can't move, you can't get out of it. If you're playing 2 players, the other player can go and start punching him to maybe rescue you, but that's the only way to get out of it. Otherwise, they just keep throwing you till you die. As you can see here once more. Fair, right? Good job, guys. There, I tricked the Williams into throwing his knife at the Abobo. And he's going out to grab another one. I would love to do it again, but I accidentally trigger him throwing it at me instead. Oh well. And I love how they throw the knife in this game. It stays pointed up. So really, you would just get hit with, like, the hilt of the knife. And I'm sure that would hurt, but it's not going to kill anybody. And if you're finding this kind of exhausting to watch because of how long it's taking, all I can say is, I apologize. Just imagine how I felt having to actually play it. It's not fun. This is taking way too long. And they should have known this was a problem and had fewer enemies on this part. And I feel like this game really needed more time in the oven before they released it. They needed to tighten up the gameplay. They needed to figure out, better movement system for the enemy AI, so they don't spend all this time slowly walking around you and then slowly walking vertically, up or down to try and get on your other side. It's too slow. They should have known it was too slow through playtesting. Like, the NES version of this game just plays so much more fluidly, and it's much faster, and it feels like you're, actually fighting and brawling with people. This one, it doesn't feel like that at all. It feels like you're doing your best to game a system that was poorly designed. And I know a lot of people prefer this version to the NES one, but I don't. I think the NES game is so much better when it comes to gameplay. Now, this was the second best home port I would say was available at the time, but if I were going to give the NES version, let's say, an 8 back in the day, this one I would have probably given a 6. You don't want to know what I would have given most of the other versions. And I don't know if you saw what I did there. Here's a little trick in this one, similar to what I did in the NES version a few times. You can get the enemies kind of stuck on a wall, and then scroll on, and then they'll just die, and you don't have to fight them at all. So I just saved about a good 5-6 minutes of having to fight and kill all 3 of those enemies. And now we're going to try and do something similar with these guys here. We have to line them up and get them stuck on a wall. Probably not going to get all 3 of them. I was only hoping to get at least 2. And we'll see if I get them. I'm pretty sure I did. There's 2 of them stuck, so now we're going to move on this way. One of the few tricks we can do in this version. I did some of this a little bit earlier if you didn't catch it also on one of the other levels. I forget which one it was. But yeah, there's a few places you can do this where you can get rid of enemies without having to actually fight them. And when the music stopped, that means those guys are dead. And the music doesn't start again until the door opens and our final boss comes out, who is Willy in this one with his machine gun, just like in most other versions of the game. And there he is. Now we have our theme song playing. And you'll notice there were 2 of the other enemies that I left off on the other side of the screen, and I did that hoping to get rid of at least one of them that way without having to finish fighting them. So we'll see if anybody shows up. Nope, so one of them died, which is why that one came down. Actually, they both died because neither one of them came back. So they both died, and then a new one came in. I'm not going to bother getting rid of this one since we're up to the last boss. We'll just try our best to keep him out of the way as we take Willy down. Squat little Willy with a really big head. And his machine gun fire is very slow in this game, and he only fires 1 bullet at a time while he's on screen. And I do like that despite the fact he is very short and squat and generally cutesified, this character is easily identifiable as Willy the boss of Double Dragon. I like that they even managed to include his fairly distinctive kick animation, which is kind of iconic and really helps to identify the character. There you go, that's the untimely end of Willy. At long last, about 23 minutes in, Double Dragon has been completed. And there's Marion, and yeah, she looks weird in this version as she does in many of the versions if you look at her. There's our game-winning hug and kiss, our gigantic reward for suffering through 4 missions of subpar gameplay. And that's it, folks. They don't even bother to give us credits in this one. All we get is this. And yeah, it says reprogrammed by Sega, but every source out there says it was Arc System Works. And again, which was a company made up primarily when it formed of prior Sega employees. So they would have just been recently employed by Sega. Alright, so I'm going to show you just a little glance of NES Double Dragon versus SMS while I finish up here. So Sega Master System Double Dragon, like I said, it's probably the second best version that you could get on home systems back in the day, at least during this era in the late 80s when the game was still kind of new and fresh. But it's still not particularly great. I mean, if you want to play 2-player, it was definitely the best version you could have played back then. But even with 2 players, it just does not stand up, I think, to the NES game or the arcade original. And it's a real shame because this game had potential, I feel like they could have done better with it, even with all the flicker. If they had tightened up, basically the gameplay technique and the play mechanics, this version of Double Dragon on Sega Master System could have easily been the best home version. But instead, we get one that looks like it was probably kinda rushed to get it out so that the NES version wouldn't have the market to itself for too long. Now, do I know for sure that's what happened? No, but it sure does look like that to me. So in the end, what we're left with is an okay version of Double Dragon that's passable. It's fun for a little bit, especially the first couple of missions, and then it just slows way down and becomes a slog in missions 3 and 4. And without the FM music, the normal PSG soundtrack that we would have heard in the US, in the UK, and other regions that didn't get the FM unit, the music's alright still, but not super great. So again, I would say the NES soundtrack is way better than the Master System PSG soundtrack for Double Dragon. So in the end, I would still recommend playing the NES version over this one if you wanted to play the best home version of Double Dragon available at the time, but this one was second place and the best way to play with a friend if you really wanted to play 2 players. But anyway, folks, tell me, what is your favorite home port of Double Dragon that was out in, let's say, between 1988 and 1990? And we're only talking Double Dragon 1 here, not any of the other versions. I know from the comments that there were plenty of people that like this version better than the NES version. But I just want to ask, I'm curious, do you still feel that way after seeing them both played from start to finish? Because I'm not trying to change anyone's minds. I'm just curious if maybe nostalgia was a factor, or you were remembering and hadn't played it in a while, and if you looked at them fresh with these new videos and thought to yourself, that looks a little different than I remember, or hey, I forgot about that thing. Just kind of curious if anybody had that kind of experience. If you have, let me know in the comments. And that'll do it for this video, my retro gaming friends. If you enjoyed the video, please like and share it online somewhere. If you haven't yet, please subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you'll never miss one of my videos. If you want to support the work that I do here, you can do that on Patreon or Ko-fi, or now through YouTube channel memberships. With that, I'll say thanks for watching, and see me later.